Hey everybody, thank you for joining us tonight for the April meeting of the IGDA Des Moines chapter. I am your co-chair, E.B. Updegraff. I'm here to get us started with a couple of things. Just reminders like we do every month. Number one, if you do not have an IGDA membership, get an IGDA membership. For just $60 a year, you get access to a whole host of great things to help you in your journey as a game developer. From knowledge, community, advocacy, great discounts on software conferences and more, as well as support. As always, being a part of IGDA, DSM, doesn't cost a thing, but being a part of the international chapter gets you access to a lot of resources. Beyond that, speaking of things that are going on at the local chapter, we have not only our monthly meetings that are going on every month on the third Tuesday, which you already know about because you are here with us during our monthly meeting, but also if you join our Slack or our Discord, which I will get you links up to right here. On our Slack and our Discord, we're having regular conversations and information for you that includes things like a monthly meeting where a bunch of members are getting together and making a game together. We also have weekly check-ins and more support from all of our members, so find us there, as well as a Minecraft server and other fun things that we're doing together. So we should be having in-person meetings soon, but while we're still online, Slack and Discord are the places to go to find us and connect with other developers. I am super excited for our presentation tonight. I'm going to go ahead and bring up Grace here and let Grace introduce themselves.
They, them pronouns. I'm from Liminal Esports, and I wanted to start out today by asking you if you all would humor me for a few minutes. I want to actually start this conversation by giving part of a talk that I've given before, except that I gave this talk to a group of teachers and school administrators a while back. So that was the audience there. And then after that, I'll tell you a little bit about us over at Liminal Esports, and then finally wrap up with a bit more specifics about esports and education. We do a lot of different things, so we'll cover a lot of different areas there. Okay, so here we go. All right. So thanks for coming, everybody. I want to start by talking about something that's known as reading-based learning. That is, using reading to learn. It's a new concept. It has some issues, but there's a growing vocal minority that believes that reading can lead to learning. Now, I want to caution you that the book that I'm going to tell you about today is not a learning book, or even an example of what some people are calling readification. I have to describe this book as an entertainment book because it is not specifically designed for education. Most of you have probably not heard about this book before, and I wouldn't expect you to read it if you had, but bear with me here for a moment. So the book's name is Hamlet, and to be honest, it's not a great name. It was written by someone named William who spent way too much time reading and way too much time writing. And I'll spare you all the details of the plot since you're probably more interested in which educational standards it's aligned to. And to be honest, on its own, outside of the hands of a teacher, it's not aligned to any standards at all. It just kind of is what it is. It's a book. And it gets worse, unfortunately. The book has a lot of complex terminology. None of it is defined. I mean, it says unfold yourself here. Like, even I don't know what that means. The formatting can be confusing to children. There's no synopsis at the start. It doesn't explain what a dramatic work is. And what's worse is that the book actually often costs money. Yes, you have to pay for the book. And I know you're gonna use your school or your library funds to buy an entertainment book when you could be buying a learning book, like a good, solid encyclopedia set. It's a hard sell for most teachers. And it actually gets worse. There is some violence in this book. It's true. People die. And I know that for some of you, that's an instant disqualification. People cannot die in anything in a school. It also tackles hard subjects like mental illness and suicide that some high school students just aren't prepared to engage with. You will have complaints from parents. You will have complaints from your administrators. But look at these kids. You might see them as wasting their time frittering it away, reading an entertainment book, but I see the engagement on their faces. I see an opportunity for educators, and in the hands of the right people, creative teachers, librarians, after-school educators, that book can become a powerful learning tool. It will take work. It's hard because you will need to create new lesson plans, activities, rubrics. You're going to need to convince people. You have to convince these naysayers that entertainment books can be as exciting and as useful as the dictionaries that you have in your classrooms right now. But I think that this is too good of an opportunity to be missed. So now let me say that it's nothing short of absurd that we can look at this picture and see it as a learning opportunity, and then look at this picture and see it as a waste of time, right? So we in the education field use words to be polite about this. We call things game-based learning or gamification or learning games because so many schools fear to use fun games in learning environments. We act as if something like this could never possibly be used to teach, right? If you see this on a student's computer, they're wasting their time. While something like this, which is a scene from Midsummer Night's Dream, is so chock full of educational content that we have to trick students into caring about it. And now I'm not necessarily going to go on the record and say that Blizzard is today's equivalent of Shakespeare, but at its core, we have a mismatch in how we're approaching these two different types of media. And so I put a question like this up here, knowing that it's a really controversial statement in education, knowing that if I ask the same question about any other form of media, a text, radio, film, music, this question will not be controversial, right? We've gotten over that hump when it comes to all other forms of media. But there's something about games, something inherent in how they interact with us in our society that makes us treat them differently for some reason. And frankly, I don't have a good explanation of why we can't use entertainment games or fun games in these settings. So what is the barrier? Why is game-based learning a niche topic? And why is the use of games in learning environments still so often considered a taboo thing? Okay, so that's my pitch. That's usually my pitch to educators and all of that, and has been in the past. And I gave that talk 5 years ago, actually, to teachers, professors, librarians, school administrators, as a representative of the government, as part of the U.S. Department of Education. And it really, I thought, when I was going back through some of my old slides, I was like, that really sums up the challenges that myself and the broader field have had with just even bringing these two topics of games and education close to each other in mainstream education. Now, I'll say that we've actually seen a ton of progress over the last 5 years, but I want to pause here, and I'm going to start. I know this is like the third time I've started this talk. I'm going to start like one more time. So hi, everybody. I'm Grace Collins. I'm the co-founder of Liminal Esports and Snowbright Studio. We have two names. We have a lot of names. I don't know what's wrong with this. We just have a lot of names. So you can see our websites here, and you can see our email. You're welcome to get in contact with me, and I'm on Twitter too. Let me tell you a little bit about us. This is the second part that I had told you about. So we're actually a mission-driven organization. We're a for-profit, but we're mostly a lot of federal civil servants and other folks that have a hard time focusing on the profit part. So our mission actually is that every student should be a part of solving the biggest challenges of today and tomorrow. That's like, whoa, that's a big mission. And I'll tell you that it was a mission for a lot of us when we were in the Obama administration, and afterwards, some of us stayed on into the Trump administration. And then when we left, we were like, do we have to stop doing good stuff? And we were like, no, I guess not. Let's just make a company to do it. So that's where a lot of our stuff comes from. We're actually a pretty strange crew. I actually am the co-founder. My other co-founder is Nika Newer. You might know her. She's the IGDA Foundation Executive Director right now as well. And we have a whole bunch of different people. Again, a lot of federal civil servants, people who used to work with me at the Smithsonian, as well as some other folks who are just out of college. It's a good group with a lot of different backgrounds. We have artists, developers, evaluators, and researchers, because that's what it takes to create an educational game, which is not a great thing, right? Because we need all these different perspectives and all these different peoples that go into it. So it takes a bit of effort. So I told you like this big goal that we have. One thing that we try to focus on a lot is gender representation in STEM. And if you're not in education, STEM is kind of a weird word. It stands for science, technology, engineering, and math. They lump them all together and they call them STEM. And so you'll see here a chart, STEM degrees, people who are graduating from college with one of those types of degrees in the United States. And if you asked anybody, like, is there, is it about parallel between women and men graduating with STEM degrees in the United States? You might think that it's close, or you might think that, well, maybe it was far apart in the past, but now it's getting closer. But as you can see here, this is 10 years of data. And we actually still every year have about a 250,000 student gap each year, right? So there's 250,000 more men graduating with STEM degrees than there are women, which is kind of weird, right? Because the gender split in college isn't super off. And this is actually data directly from the U.S. Department of Education. And there's another blip here. You might notice there's only 2 lines. So non-binary folks like us, we're not even counted. So there might be actually 0 non-binary people who are graduating from STEM degrees each year. Not really sure. So that's a problem that we're trying to set out to solve a bit, to make sure that everyone has access to these STEM degrees and to that kind of pathway. Why are we doing this? Well, for one thing, we've seen that a lot of parents believe in that, right? So like you can see some of the stats here, right? Virtually all parents believe that STEM education should be a priority for the United States. That's a heck of a mandate, honestly. And then you'll also see this one down here at the bottom, right? That a lot of male students enjoy games, books, and other things that got them into STEM. And certainly I found that a lot of other gamers, like myself, have fallen into STEM because of their love for games and their passion for technology. So that's one way that we go about things. I mentioned that we actually have 2 different kind of like organizations under our little umbrella. The first one, Liminal Esports, really focuses on trying to tackle this problem from a research perspective and from an advocacy perspective. So we do that through a number of different ways. Many of them are not public, but a couple of them are, so I'll share those with you. One is that we just launched this website a little bit ago. It's called K12esportsnews.com. And it tracks news that's relevant to esports in education between kindergarten and 12th grade. We have this habit of finding problems and then trying to fix problems. We saw a problem. There was no place that was actually collecting information about esports in primary and secondary education. Or if there was information coming out about it, it was primarily focused through leagues or through gaming companies. Well, there's a conflict of interest there. So we actually created this site to track along with it. So that's one thing that we do that we're hoping elevates the education behind what people think about games in the classroom. Another thing that we've done, there's a lot of challenges to getting games like into the classroom, whether that's like physically bringing them in or like installing them or getting the hardware set up and all that sort of stuff. So we wrote and released a policy paper on how the government can support schools in doing that more safely and securely, right? So if you look through the Day One project, we wrote a policy memo for the Biden administration about how the Department of Education can better support educational technology security. Because a lot of teachers and administrators actually won't install games because they don't think that they're secure, or they have problems handling their firewalls, all sorts of different mundane details that prevent kids from actually tapping into that. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the liminal esports side because, like I said, a lot of our work falls kind of into this advocacy or outreach or education aspect. I'll talk a little bit about Snowbright Studio, though. So as you can see, totally different branding. So Snowbright Studio, we figured out that as we were building liminal esports and as we were collecting all of this research, we needed something to do with it. Because we would pass on the research that we were doing about education and games to AAA companies and other folks, and they would say, that's interesting, right? Which is great. Maybe we'll get you on the docket for next year's patches or things like that. But in the meantime, we had kids graduating every year. So we kind of said, okay, we have to actually do something with this research now if we want to make an impact on students. So we said, well, we might as well make our own games too. And since it's kind of weird having a research company publish games, we made a studio to do that. So I won't go into the games too much, although I'm happy to answer questions about them. But these are three of the titles that we've been working on right now. So you'll see the two cats, that's Ari and Zoe. They're time traveling 80s cats who teach you how to learn Unity, which I'll show another slide about. That's Doran, the Hop Top Wizard, and he is that's from our game Enchanted Forest, which focuses on environmental science and particularly targets kids with neurobehavioral disorders like ADHD and autism, and providing them with environmental science content within a place that supports their executive functioning as well. And then the third one there is from our AI learning game, Tiny Sprites. And our argument here is that kids don't think that it's magic when the lights turn on in their house. At least they shouldn't, right? Like they might not fully understand how the power gets from there to there. Like I have the Magic School Bus book, so I get it, but like they might not. So they don't think it's magic, right? They don't think there's a wizard on the other end. They don't think it's magic when their car turns on. So they probably shouldn't think it's magic when Netflix recommends them something that they would like, right? But they do. They feel has that kind of like, how did they know that? It must be wizardry sort of thing. And so Tiny Sprites is there to kind of address that problem, and in a no coding interface too, because way too often artificial intelligence is treated as like, well, that's your upper level elective in your senior year at high school. And AI is so important right now. We need to actually start that education much, much younger. So those are an example of, those are areas that we found are needed. Those are areas that during our research, we were like, okay, this needs to be happening, and more messaging needs to happen around this. And particularly, it needs to be supportive of people of different genders so that we have everyone working on this problem. This is the last slide about Snowbright Studio. But so this is our Time Tales game, which I promised you I tell you a little bit more about. I thought it might be relevant since many of you use Unity as well. But what I found, I'm a former teacher, is that I would teach my 9th grade students Scratch. And they love Scratch, but they had been doing Scratch for like ever, right? So at 9th grade, they'd come in and they'd be like, not another Scratch class, please. And it was seen as kind of like babyish and all that sort of stuff. And okay, fine. So then in 10th grade, I would teach them Unity, and I would open up Unity and they would just be like, what is that? Like, you have summoned the devil. Like, come on. This is just a bunch of gray boxes here. It looks nothing like Scratch. And so I would just like kind of watch them drop out of the class, which was really sad to see, right? I'm like, okay, no longer a STEM major, no longer a STEM major, because I showed them Unity and it scared them, right? So there was no real bridge to get them from that one place to the other place. And so that's why we created Time Tales. So we had a successful Kickstarter last fall. The first episode of Time Tales will be coming out in July. And it's a series of time traveling games where it looks like a fake Unity interface, more or less. It's not, we're actually partnering with Unity on this. And it unveils different parts of the interface over time. So you don't get that immediately overload function. Instead, you say, oh, okay, let me just focus on what X and Y means first, right? And then you see different parts of it appear over time. Along the way, we accidentally, we made these characters because we believed in them. And Ari happens to be non-binary. And then we suddenly found out this is the first learning game that has a canonically non-binary character in it, which again is like, come on, people, it's 2021. So we're happy about that too. Just finding these little places for representation in games. Again, it's something that we never saw when we were growing up. We still ended up in the field, so that's great. But having more role models for folks helps too. All right, back to these guys. So I don't know if you remember these guys because it seems like a really long time ago. But I'm guessing that most of you can identify at least one person in this picture. So that's former President Barack Obama in the back. And then in the foreground, I'll give you props if you recognize him. That's former Secretary of Education John King. And so And then my boss, who's I worked for both Richard Culata and Joseph South, and they reported to John King. So that was like my boss's boss and then my boss's boss's boss. And they both cared a lot about games and they cared a lot about data. And they saw the US Department of Education as a civil rights agency, which it is. It was the US Department of Education was created to make sure that everyone had equal access to education. Sounds like a good thing, right? Well, around the end of the Obama administration, that was when we started making a bigger push around games and education. And it was thankfully and hopefully also the time when I was there. So why games and education? Whatever is going on with a kid when they're playing a game, my argument is and has always been that there is a lot of learning going on. Now, maybe that learning doesn't look immediately apparent, right? But at the very least, they're learning how to jump over a pit full of crocodiles, right? If anyone else has read that Ralph Koster book, I think he lays out a pretty convincing argument for it. But there's a lot more going on there too. There's a lot more around teamwork, perseverance, and grit, as well as things like angles, and all kinds of other topics. So it makes sense for the Department of Education, I think, to take that seriously in the same way that we would take film or books or any other form of media seriously. And if that kind of learning can be better understood, better supported, better nurtured, then maybe we'd be able to connect with students in new ways and help some of the kids who had fallen through the cracks because maybe they weren't the most social or the best test takers, or maybe they had too much attitude, which was definitely me when I was in high school. But maybe games spoke to them in a different way. So that's a theory, at least. So why don't we start talking about esports in the government? Because that was the first. I admit I was the person who brought that up. I was like, these esports things, and they're like, sports, and I'm like, no, esports. You don't capitalize the S. So why did we start looking about esports in particular? As we were working on this games and education stuff, we started to hear more and more about esports scholarships, right? So esports scholarships in college started around 2014 with Robert Morris College. And at first it was just them, honestly. And then there are a couple other schools and then a couple more. And you can see this was, like I said, about 5 years ago. And you can see there were not so many. And then there was more, and then there was more, and then there was more. And kind of like there's this big boom of esports scholarships. And normally it takes a long time for higher education to catch up with itself. It takes a long time for a pattern to replicate across multiple universities. But here we were seeing things kind of rapidly coalesce around this esports topic. So it wasn't just in a particular city or region either. It was nationwide, really. So it made sense to look into it. And the reason, again, going back to the civil rights agency aspect of this, if esports are deciding which students got money for college, they're also deciding which students get accepted into college, deciding which faculty members and staff colleges hired, which buildings colleges get built. There's an opportunity there. There's a risk too, especially from a civil rights perspective. So at the time, I saw a lot of this. A lot of the marketing materials that we were seeing 5 years ago, and I think some of them have changed since then, but particularly when this started coming out, and demographics and all that sort of stuff, we saw the same thing kind of like over and over and over. And I don't know how to describe this other than saying that they were marketing to bros, right? Like somebody somewhere got the idea that like bros are who we need in this esports program. And I don't have a problem with bros. Some of my best friends are bros. But you expect that some people would be confused, right? If all of the things that said esports had like bros on them. And they're like, is it for me? Maybe not. So again, we actually looked into having a White House event and stuff, and we're like, okay, well, we have a White House event, like who's going to be on the invite list? And we looked down, and we're like, all of these people are coming from the same place. They all have the same background. Like, what is going on in this esports world? And then then somebody said the thing that I hate the most. It's like my least favorite thing, which is maybe girls don't play games. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. Girls do play games, right? Like plenty of girls play games. This is, if you don't know, this is the CLG Red, right? Professional all women esports team. But our question was like, I know that girls play games. I've met them, right? So where are they? Why aren't they showing up on these lists? Why aren't they on the esports scholarship list? Why aren't they on the esports teams? Why aren't they on the esports marketing, right? Maybe it doesn't trickle down, right? Like that's the next thing. It's like, well, it's a pipeline problem then. No, lots of girls play games, right? Not just at the professional level are either, right? So this is from the Entertainment Software Association. They release annual numbers about gender diversity and other things in games. And as you can see, it's about a 50-50 split, right? So there are plenty of women playing games too. So why aren't they showing up on the esports teams? Why aren't they showing up in colleges in particular? All right, so bear with me. Yeah, I know I've asked you to bear with me like 5 times already, but it's a little bit of a leap. All right, so because this is the part where we talk about Die Hard, because Die Hard is a fantastic movie, right? It's got action, it's got suspense. Really, you're gonna have to stick with me for a minute here. It's got like throwing Alan Rickman out of a building. It's got some holiday jingles in it. And the one thing that Die Hard doesn't have a whole lot of is women, and there aren't a whole lot of women in it. And to be fair, there aren't as many women fans. There aren't as many female fans of Die Hard as male fans. And you know what? That's okay. Like, it's okay to have a movie that more men like than women. The problem for me and the problem for like the Department of Education is when somebody decides to make like a Die Hard fan club and you run Die Hard movie nights and you say that the people who spend the most time learning about Die Hard get college scholarships. And then you start seeing more and more of those people go, right? That's great for them, but you're missing people. No matter how great of a movie Die Hard is, you're going to be missing people. I don't know if that analogy makes 100% sense, but I hope you're with me because I think it'll clarify. If you're still a little lost, it'll clarify in a little bit. And so we see this time and again in esports, right? Where are all the girl gamers for game X or game Y? And the response usually is, we need to do more outreach to girls, right? They don't understand what they're missing. And I want you to understand that doing outreach to women for a game that is primarily popular for men is kind of like running around a school trying to convince girls that Die Hard is a Christmas movie. And as you can see from the factual data that I've provided here, a lot of them just are not buying it. So I call this the Die Hard problem, right? Like if you set up an esports club if you set up a film club, right, and you advertise that the first movie is going to be Die Hard, you're going to get a certain group. And if you ask that group what they want to see the next time they come, they're probably going to say Die Hard 2. And if you ask them what they want to do after that, they're probably going to say Die Hard 3, right? And you get this self-fulfilling cycle where you have the same type of people coming in again and again and again. And that becomes the identity. And that becomes the club that it is. And it's not fair to say that like all films are for men, right? Like just based on a sample size of one. But it is fair to say that Die Hard was marketed towards men by a very well-funded and professional marketing team, the same kinds of marketing teams that market games to kids, right? So this is the part where I say I made the exact same mistake that I just pointed out and tried to start a Die Hard club myself. So I was really excited when I left the Department of Education during the first part of the Trump administration, and I moved out to Cleveland, Ohio. Started working at a beautiful independent all-girls school out here named Hathaway Brown. It's consistently ranked one of the best all-girls schools in Ohio, and number 1 or 2 best independent schools. It's got a ton of innovative programs, passionate faculty members, awesome CIO. It was a perfect place for me, right? It was like a perfect place to try doing esports in schools. Everything was set up, and I came in, and I'm like literally the expert on esports in education. I brought it up, right? Like I was the first one to mention it. That makes me the expert, I think. So I came in, and I was like, you have everything here needed for this. This is going to be amazing. Everybody says it's a pipeline problem, but I know that girls play games. Let's do this. And so we did. I set up some. I put up all my Die Hard flyers, right? And I said, like, we're going to start an esports club, and I tried to do everything by the book. And so we of course we're going to play League of Legends, right? Because that's what everybody was playing, especially 3 years ago. And we had 400 girls and gender diverse students in the upper school, and out of 400 of them, two showed up for the club, only two. And it was a disaster, right? And like everybody was like, "You've been talking about this since you got here, and you got like two students. One of them's heard of the game, and the other one's like, I'm just here for the chips, right?" Um, and so then I hear, of course, the what I told you is my least favorite thing to hear, which is, well, maybe girls just don't play games. I'm like, no, they do. I swear they do. Don't take my bad event planning as an implication that girls don't play games. I taught game design and computer science at that school, and I can tell you firsthand how passionate those girls are. So why didn't they show up? Why didn't they show up for my Die Hard movie night? I think you already know the answer, right? So I hit the reset button and I spent a few months retooling everything. And I came up with the idea of playing not just one game, but actually focusing on multiple games. And the reasoning is that, and you're going to be like, oh, different kids like different games, right? So if I focus only on one game, particularly one game that is heavily marketed towards one type of kid, well, guess what? I'm only getting one type of student to show up. And that student didn't really exist at an all-girls school, as I found out. So if I focus on three, then I start getting more people in the door, not just along gender lines either, but just different types of players, right? People who like to engage in different types of game play. And if I tie all three together and make a season out of it, I had something that starts to look like a team. So you'll see from some of these poorly fonted stats here that you can probably barely read, that from one pretty large study, only about 7% of first-person shooter players identify as female, 10% of MOBA players, and only 2% of sports games, right? So now again, non-binary people don't exist in this. We apparently don't play games, but you can see, just like if you come into a school and you say, well, we're going to play Madden today, well, guess what? Statistically speaking, you're going to end up with a team full of boys. Maybe that's what you want, but again, when you start passing out scholarship money for it, it becomes a problem. So like I said, I retooled it, and in about a week after retooling the thing and the esports league and adding 3 different games, I had 10 students try to sign up. So like clearly they were ready to play games. I just had to give them something that made sense to them. And these weren't traditional girly titles either, right? Like we weren't playing like Barbie rides a unicorn into space. We were playing like Hearthstone and Heroes of the Storm. We were even playing Rocket League, which again, like they grumbled about it, but like because again, 2% is what I was working with there. But we played it, and they liked it okay. They didn't ask for it again next year, but they liked it okay. So there were a few students who were interested enough in each to actually field a team. And by the next year, we instantly hit our cap. So we actually had a cap of 20 people on the team. And the next year we were at max capacity already. So this is a picture of the championship game that we hosted that first season. I was hoping to get like one educational story out of this. If you can't tell, I'm kind of a story kind of person. And so I was hoping like for this esports program to change just one student, or to make a difference to one person. But in the end, it actually changed, and I'm not exaggerating. It changed every single student who played on that team that first year. Every single student had a story to tell at the end of it about friendship, about falling in love with computer science, about advocacy. They cared, and esports helped them get there. And it wasn't even that much esports. We played like 6 games that year, but they cared. It gave them an identity. So at this championship game, we were awful, by the way. I was an awful coach. Like we won almost no games, but that first year we like won the last game. It was like really exciting. It was like the worst Heroes of the Storm game that you have ever seen, and they won in the last minute, and they were so excited. I'm so proud of them. Could have gone either way, but they won. So this championship game did not feature our team, but 2 other teams came in, and they came from completely different areas in Ohio. One very rural, one very urban. And I expected the students to show up and be excited. What I didn't expect were the parents to show up and be excited. And did they show up? They literally showed up in a bus. Like, I'm not even kidding. Like a bus pulled up to the school and parents started pouring out. Not only that, but they showed up 45 minutes early for the game as well. I was still like throwing tablecloths. As you can see, I did not get to these tables by then. And I said, why are you here? Parents in a bus? Like, why are you here 45 minutes early for this like 4 hour event? And one of them came up to me and said, this is what they said to me. They're like, this is the first time my kid has done anything. Like my kid never did choir, never did clubs, never did sports, never brought home a trophy. And he's been talking to me about this esports thing. And now he said that they want to put him up on a stage for it, right? And so like I'm here, like I'm here for my kid. They had found their place through that. Um, so it's bittersweet though, right? Because we were the first ever to do this at an all-girls school. That's 2019, right? It took me and this craziness to come to this school and set it up. It took all the way until 2019 for somebody to do this. And these students had benefited so immediately and so much from something that was so small, allowing them to play 6 games over the course of a year, right? And the next thing I know, one of them who didn't even like computer science at the start of the year was like coming by after school, laying wires, had set up a vMix machine with 15 feeds streaming live on Twitch. I'm like, I don't even want to stream and figure this out. Just like, I got it. It was a small thing, but it became something that changed their lives, honestly. And like I said at the start of this, we started looking at esports at the Department of Education because it's a civil rights issue. 5 years ago, we were worried that this new trend that was starting up in colleges and higher education would lead to an esports scholarship gap, lead to yet another scholarship gap that once again put fewer women in STEM fields, and an even greater gap for gender access. And so this report came out last month. We were right to worry, right? So based on some of our research and work and advocacy at Liminal, the Associated Press went out and did their own independent study, which showed that 90% of esports scholarships are going to men. And so this was pulled through public records requests submitted to a sample of universities across the United States. And it's not like when they asked me, I was like, they're like, isn't this shocking? And I'm like, no, this is what we've been saying for years. Like, if you give scholarships for Madden, guess what? Like, you're giving scholarships to boys. And again, that's not a bad thing. It's okay, but like we need to consider some of the civil rights implications at the same time. We've always done that through Title IX for sports programs. Why aren't we doing it through esports programs too? We as game developers know how much of an impact games can make on someone's life. And as a teacher, again, I've seen how games and esports can put someone on the fast track to a career in science and technology. There's a huge opportunity here, right? And that's how I want to think about it. I don't, some people flip this around and they say like, oh, it was push down the men or something. No, like there's this huge opportunity for everybody to be playing games, right? There's a huge opportunity for all the girls, and yes, even the non-existent non-binary people to be playing games too, and to get more STEM degrees and help us with these really critical science and technology problems that our nation's going to be facing, like, I don't know, artificial intelligence and climate change and other things. We need more people involved in STEM. Games are a great pathway for it. There's a huge opportunity here for us to address that, and that's through games. So this is anticlimactic, I guess, but that's my presentation. That's my pitch. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. This is why we continue our work and our advocacy at Liminal Esports. And this is why we show up when we can to say these things to other people, particularly game developers, because when you're making stuff, you can help change some of this too. So happy to take questions, but that's all the slides that I had.
Thank you so much. And everybody who's listening on YouTube right now, or feel free to put it up in Slack. If you have any questions, just let us know and I will pass them along. I'm just wondering if someone's developing a game and they do want to have more representation in it, and perhaps by putting characters in or themes in that may not be something that they have personal experience with, but they do believe that the representation is necessary. What advice would you give them to make their game more representative of sort of the spectrum of genders or race or things like that?
Yeah, that's a hard first question. So
Sorry,
thank you.
it's a big first
Uh,
question.
yeah, no, I mean it's hard, right? They say like to go back to the book analogy, they say write what you know, right?
Mhm.
Like and often you don't know that. So the only way that you can add in that kind of representation is by talking with and meeting with and hanging out with and learning more about that piece, right? And they're just and I think that's why, honestly, I think that's why there's sometimes so little representation in games is because that takes time and it takes relationship building and it's a lot easier sometimes to sit down and tell your life story through your game as opposed to work with someone else. I remember one of the projects that I'm proud of is that we were able to secure federal funding through another company that I worked at to create a game that tracked the ancestral Puebloan peoples of Mesa Verde, which is just this ancient culture with people who are still there and living now, and they're actually using this language that is endangered. So I think there's about 500 people who still know this language, right? So this language is may disappear. And we pitched doing a game that goes through the history and the culture, as well as integrating the actual language into the game, so that like this language will live on, right? Like in a game, right? I think I mentioned briefly. I used to work at the Smithsonian, and so there's a lot of museum mindedness that I try to bring sometimes, and it's like we have the opportunity to preserve some of that. We have to do it in a culturally responsive way, right? And the reason why so few of these grants happen sometimes and so few of these contracts is because you have to build a relationship with the communities, right? You can't just come in and say, hey, you're so neat, we're going to make a game about you, because that feels really awful, right? It's very colonialist. And so we had to spend months and months and months working with experts in the field and speaking through liaisons and talking to other folks to get actual feedback and get their actual voices involved in these sorts of things. So I don't know if there is an easy way outside of, like, again, expanding yourself as a human being and meeting more people, which is always a good thing. I highly recommend it. But the one thing I would say is that it does matter. It matters a whole heck of a lot. We see that often so going back to the research, girls, and again, there's very little research on non-binary folks in STEM, but for girls in particular in STEM, the biggest moment of their lives comes between the ages of 13 and 16. That's when they start picking up on the gendered representations in STEM and science, and they start seeing this is not for me. And you can watch it, like anecdotally, you'll see this and that, but you can watch it statistically and say, this is where they're falling out. Right here, right at this year in their life, they're like, I'm not going to survive in that. I need to get out. And the biggest antidote to that, and again, this is like right backed up research, the biggest antidote to that, role models. Just being able to see yourself in that position and say, oh, well, maybe there is something for me, right? Not seeing the billboard that has scientists and it's only, like the 60-year-old white guy with the big floofy hair. It's like being able to see more types of people. It doesn't even necessarily have to look exactly like you, right? But just seeing that it's welcoming to lots of different kinds of people. So representation in any type of story, I think, really tremendously speaks to people from across different demographics. I don't think it's like pandering here sometimes, right? Like, no, you're actually reflecting more what the world is by adding in that kind of diversity to it. And I wouldn't worry about like trying to make sure that you check off like all the boxes either. I think showing that you've taken an intentional step forward by including multiple people and building relationships and providing meaningful stories, it's going to, guess what, make your story and your game a lot better just on the surface of it, even setting everything else aside.
For sure. I think it's really interesting to have the representational approach because so often I think when we talk about how different genders play games, a lot of it comes down to game mechanics or things like that when really representation is so rarely talked about and is such a huge part of it. So I really love that approach to it. And I think along the lines of one of the questions that we have in the YouTube channel, what is the connection that you see between uh, gaming and STEM? How does one lead into the other?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's actually a whole there's a whole world of educational research around something called interest-based learning, which branches off into project-based learning and other sorts of dash-based learnings. And game-based learning kind of fits in that penumbra. And I think that what you're really looking at is that games can spark imagination. Games can spark interest, right? And so my biggest like one of my favorite pet theories in education is actually called Homago. So hey, it's by Professor Mimi Ito, who's out in University of California, Irvine, and it's like hanging out, messing around, geeking out, right? So like and this is how I set up a game lab in the high school where I used to teach. Hanging out, right? You make a space where students can come and hang out, right? They're not there to do a specific thing. It's okay for them to be a little bit silly. Like they just hang out, messing around. You set out a bunch of weird things, like things that like it's okay to touch and just mess around with a little bit, right? So I put out, like a classic NES, and I put out not a stress ball, a carpal tunnel ball, right? And I put out like a pinata, and I put out a couple board games, and eventually they just kind of get around and start messing around with stuff. And then eventually they find something that they care about, and that's when they do the deep dive. That's when they start going into the geeking out realm, right? So you're not going to get. I really dislike when people say like, well, you play the game and then you become a computer scientist. Like, no, that's not how it happens, right? Like you play the game and it sparks an interest in you, and that leads to a lifelong passion for something. And for some students, that's going to be STEM. Just naturally, some of them are going to say, like, I want to make a game like that. How do I program? Right? Like that's one that's obvious. We played a competitive game that was on drone racing, right? And so then we had some students who were like, that was a lot cooler than I thought it was going to be. I'm going to go home and build a drone, right? Which is the first steps towards robotics. We had plenty of other people who were like sitting there in the back, like sketching everybody as they were doing stuff, right? That became their geeking out. Like they came to hang out, they messed around with some stuff. They found that what they really like to do is put their headphones on and do sketches of game characters and other people while they're hanging out there. That's perfectly fine too. I think the biggest thing though is respecting the students as individuals who have interests that they can guide themselves, and providing them the opportunities to go on that path. And again, some of them are just naturally going to fall. You have so much tech around. Some of them are just going to naturally fall into it. Again, I did not expect anybody to be like clipping wires and taping them to the carpet, but that's what they wanted to do. Because I said, I don't want to bother with Twitch streaming. And they're like, no, this is going on Twitch. I'm like, fine, do it yourself.
Love it. We have one question about the reports that Liminal Esports puts out. Are those available to the public? Are they behind a paywall, or is there some way people could get a hold of those?
Well, we're not profit seeking enough to paywall anything. Maybe we should. We'll look into that. They might be paywalled next week. But no. I would say we're trying our best right now. It's been a soft launch for K-12 esports news, but you'll see we're improving that pretty rapidly. So we're trying to aggregate stuff as it comes out there. When it comes to the policy paper that I mentioned, that is available there. It's up on the day1project.org. That's a whole bunch of science and technology policy proposals for the Biden administration. And we have some other gender and STEM and esports reports, and those were developed internally. Those have not been released. We're probably not going to release them, but we're happy to talk to you all if we do. We have passed them on to certain AAA publishers to encourage them to improve how they're doing representation in their games, and other sorts of things like that. But yeah. And we also, so that's some of the stuff that we do. But we'll paywall it. Don't worry. We'll figure out a way.
Any more questions on YouTube? And I'm going to ask that, and then I'm going to wait a few seconds because there's a bit of latency between when I ask that and when everybody gets to see it.
And you can always tweet at us too. So if you're like, hey, I'm wondering about like this research report, or is there any research out on this? If you tweet at us about that, we'll try and rustle something up and get it for you. I don't know if we just sign ourselves up as a library, but we do that sometimes too. Um,
Fantastic. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions come in, so I think for now we'll call an end to it and say thank you so much. This was an incredible presentation and giving us a lot to think about. And for anyone who has any follow-up questions, like Grace said, you can tweet at them. I have a handle for Grace, and I know on Grace's Twitter, they have links to Liminal Esports and other accounts. So put your questions there, but otherwise we're going to call it a night. Thank you so much.
yeah, thanks so much, and so glad to be out here and being able to talk to folks. We're super curious in your games and stuff too. So feel free to just shoot us if you're working on something. Feel free to shoot it over to us. Like I said, if it's competitive or esports related at all, let us know and we'll post about it on K-12 Esports News. We've already done that for some Kickstarter games and stuff like that too. Just trying to make sure that people can get seen. So.
All right. Thank you.